Hello everyone, long time no see. This is going to be a video about 3D for beginners. In this introductory video, I'm going to look into 3D modeling and the different industries that are currently using this particular platform to create and innovate and of course transform a lot of the industries that we are a part of. So a lot of you may have been working in Adobe Dimension, but the app actually has been suspended. So Adobe has now unveiled a whole suite dedicated to 3D modeling. So it's called Adobe Substance, and out of the apps that are available in this particular suite, we have Adobe Stager and Designer and Sampler and a couple more. But I am going to be focusing today on Adobe Stager. So Adobe Stager is basically a professional scene design and rendering application where you can combine 3D models and 2D images to essentially create these really awesome photorealistic pictures. So you can essentially incorporate a lot of these 3D models into your workflow and day-to-day activities to elevate the design process and open up new opportunities. For me, because I come from the fashion world and apparel and textiles, I believe that the 3D world presents an amazing opportunity for us to essentially be a little bit more sustainable and ethically oriented when it comes to product packaging and product development in general, and of course product prototyping. So I should mention that although all of this looks really cool and awesome, it's still work in progress. Even Adobe is constantly innovating and working on fixing a lot of different issues and bugs. There's still room for improvement, but for now we can definitely play around and see what we can come up with. So let's go ahead and explore the workspace. Similar to a lot of the Creative Cloud apps that you may be used to, like Photoshop and Illustrator, InDesign and so on, you might be able to notice some of the tools that have similar icons, and you might be able to guess what they could represent. But undoubtedly, Adobe Substance, and specifically the app that we're exploring within Adobe Substance, which is Adobe Stager, has introduced some new icons. So first, what I'd like to go over is, of course, the workspace. You have two different modes. You have the design mode, which is the one we're currently in, and then of course you have the render mode. The render mode is essentially the section where you can select after you're finished with your overall design. The next thing what we have in here is similar again to a lot of the apps that Adobe has. We have a toolbar. So the toolbar essentially gives you different ways to interact with the content that you are choosing to work with. You can, as you can see, you have the magic wand, which a lot of you are familiar with. You have the sampler tool, which is a little bit different. It has different action than what we're used to in Photoshop and so on. We have the box, which is allowing us to draw custom shapes. We also have environment lighting, but a lot of these tools are also available in the starter assets as well as in the scene section, which I'll explain in a little bit. Now, these three tools right here are the ones that you might want to remember by heart, because it really is the essence of the 3D world. The first one is the orbit. So I'm going to go ahead and click on number one, and what this will allow me to do is it'll allow me to turn my object around so I can explore the entire 3D scene. Number two, which is the keyboard or the shortcut for the pan, it'll move the camera up, down, left, right. So something along these lines. And then number three, which is right here, this is your dolly. It'll move the camera forward and backwards. This is really helpful when you're trying to see the big picture. As soon as you get into the scene, it is really helpful to essentially work with these three options to navigate and to get closer to your design to make it as photorealistic as possible. Now you also have something called the viewport control bar, similar to the control panel. in the Creative Cloud. This is where you can add certain cameras. You can turn on ray tracing, which essentially allows you to see the work after it'll be rendered, or as close to what it might look like after it's being rendered. Now, we usually turn off ray tracing while we're working because it really does slow down the process. So you really turn on ray tracing when you're trying to slow down and pause and see what the lighting effect is, what the model looks like, what the product or the general picture is, or how it's coming along essentially. Next we also have, I'm going to go ahead and turn it off. Next we also have the document panel. So the document panel is this section right here. We have three different areas. We have the scene area, the action area, and the properties area. The scene area essentially allows you to see all of the different models that you have placed into your environment, into your scene. The action allows you to see and trace a lot of the steps and look into the properties and the lights that you have been using so far. And then of course the properties section allows you to further dive into the ground, the background, and then of course the lights that you have chosen for your setting. Again, it might sound overwhelming, but we will get through it one step at a time. So what are really the fundamentals? The fundamentals of 3D design is that you have the models, aka my crossover bag, which represents the 3D form. You have the materials, which essentially dress up the 3D model or help transform the appearance of that model. You also have the lights and the cameras, which provide the perspective and really help set the scene and provide that photorealistic experience that we're looking for in 3D modeling. And then the last one is, of course, you have ray tracing and rendering, which allow you to first preview what your setting or your scene could look like. And then, of course, the last one, the rendering, is the final finished product that you are able to distribute. Before we move on to the next scene, I'd like you to just play around with some of these buttons and get used to them. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna start from scratch. I'm going to start a new plane, and I'm going to slowly add everything together so that we can come up with this particular visual that you see right here. And start with a new plane, and we're going to import a 3D model. I'm going to use the crossover bag that I showed you just now, but you are welcome to choose whichever model you have on hand, something you may have used from Adobe stock to download, or maybe something you've created yourself from the Adobe Substance Designer app. Again, Stager is not the modeling app. We have other apps that work on the actual 3D model, but we're going to go ahead and borrow a model just so that we can look into the overall scene. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this, because what I'm looking into is you can of course open something you've already worked on, or you can go ahead and create something new. So I'm going to click on create something new. Just ignore that. And this is where we're going to begin. It's essentially a black hole. It's the universe. You can do whatever you'd like in this plane right here. So what we're gonna start with is I'd like you to explore some of the basic shapes that are available to us. So you have the text, the cube, the sphere, torus, cone, plane, cylinders, lots of different ways that you could begin working with. And then of course lots of different models that are already available. I'm gonna go ahead and use the matte because I feel like the Adobe Substance, that's their icon, that's their logo. And I'm gonna go ahead and have you all explore the orbit, the pan, the dolly, and then of course the way you work with the model itself. So you've got arrows pointing into each different direction, and of course you've got the circles that allow you to rotate to certain areas, like rotate X, Y, Z, and so on. The scale Y, if you click and hold, it'll allow you to make the object bigger. If you click and scroll down, it'll make it smaller. If you use the arrow pointing up, it'll allow it to go up. And then the same thing for the other areas as well. I can make it smaller, I can make it bigger, I can make it go left, make it go right. And then of course, with the rotations, these are also really fun. You could make it turn towards you, you could make it full, and so on and so forth. Now, the interesting thing that I love about Stager and a lot of the Substance apps is that you can actually move a line based on the surface, which is really helpful because it allows the model to stay focused on one particular area. If I were to put something next to it, that is just way too big, but I'll give you an idea right here. So I'm gonna go ahead and put the panel right here. So if I were to put the mat onto this pedestal, and if I click and hold onto the center, it'll essentially travel with it. See how this works? It'll travel with it. So you don't have to turn on collide anymore. It's just embedded within it. So here's my mat, and he is happily sitting onto his pedestal. Now, another thing that I wanted to show you guys is what happens if you're not an expert into creating your own models yet, but there are certain pieces or elements of the model that you don't like. If you hold Command and so first I'm going to go ahead and use this selection tool to select a model because I have multiple models in here. So if I were to select, let's say, the mat, and if I were to hold Command, I'm actually able to separate the mat into different pieces, or as many as Stager will allow me depending on how it was created. So that can be helpful because, let's say, maybe, okay, let's keep his head on. We like his head, but maybe I don't like the pedestal on top of the pedestal, so maybe I'll just delete that and I'll just use the mat right here to sit directly onto my pedestal. So lots of different ways to make whatever design, whatever scene you'd like to have, make it your own essentially. You're welcome to search the Adobe Substance 3D Assets library for lots of different assets to find whatever it is that you may be looking for. Or you can use the models right here from the starter assets to essentially get you started. So what I'd like to do first is essentially start by exploring the different materials that are available to me from the starter assets. Of course, you can download your own textiles from the asset library. You can eventually, when you get a little bit more advanced, you can use the designer and material app from Substance to essentially make your own materials, which is really cool. I'll probably try to make a video about that as well at some point. But for now, what we're going to look into is the assets that are available to us right here. By the way, if you double click right here into the scene, you are essentially able to rename everything, which is really helpful moving forward. So I'm going to go ahead and call this my crossover bag. And then if you keep dropping down the arrows right here, you'll see that it is made out of multiple different models and elements. My favorite way of just applying and working with elements pretty quickly is drag and drop. That's my default. So what I usually do is when I find something that I like, by the way, in Stager you can just click on it and it'll apply it, but what I don't like is that it always applies to the whole model instead of one particular area. So I'm going to go ahead and Command Z or Edit Undo to focus on one specific area. Double click on this one particular bag in here and I'll say, let's go ahead and apply this particular material to it. And as you can see, it's maybe a little too big on the scale, so I like to repeat the pattern. For those of you who are in fashion, you're gonna love this. This is amazing. I'm gonna go ahead and repeat the pattern so that way it gives me essentially a repeat of the same pattern of the same material at a smaller scale. Pretty cool. So again, I'm gonna go ahead and use the double click section to try to keep applying different options. Now this tweed fabric right here, when you go into the properties of the crossover bag, you can see that I've applied to the whole main mesh, which is the whole outside body of the bag. If I go down here to, transform, I'm able to transform not only the position of that particular selection, but also I'm able to transform the object, and I'm able to transform most importantly, the material. So I'm going to go ahead and set it to 2, and you can see that it's coming in place. It's certainly looking much better. Earlier it was way too scaled up. It did not look realistic at all. You're also able to use the offset button, and you're able to use the substance or the tweet area to increase the resolution, to add a certain default, and one of my most favorite ones, you can change the yarn color. So you can really be creative. So let's say you were more onto, I don't know, that's what you were going for. You can certainly apply that, and the cool thing about substance is that it saves the color. If I wanted to apply the tweed right here, and I'm going to go into material right here again, and I will increase the repeat to 2. If I scroll down to my color, you'll see that it saved the previous color. So very good, very helpful for anyone who is again working in this particular industry, where one slight difference between hues in different colors can really mean the world for a lot of us. Anyhow, so now I did want to mention that if you keep scrolling down, this is something you'll just have to explore and play around with, but you're able to make all sorts of changes to not only the material you're working with, but also to the 3D model you're working with. So I highly encourage you to work in the material section and explore everything that's available to you. So once I select one element from the bag or from the object, I like to make sure that I apply the same settings or the same materials all throughout. As you can see, this is the hook on one side, but of course it has a hook on the other side too. And then this bag, which is essentially the same, it's just positioned differently, will also have a hook. So I like to go into my scene right here, and then if it's not drop down to see what your model is made out of. Find the same areas that would apply the same material, select them all, and then of course go into your materials. Let's say you can choose, I assume the metal hook is going to be made out of metal, so you can choose materials that are available already in the library, in the starter assets library, like that. And for example, now that you have selected all 4 of them, if you deselect, I'm going to go ahead and use my 1, 2, 3, meaning I'm going to zoom in right here and then go up a little bit just so I can see the detail right here. So it's looking pretty good. But if you would like to, picture it as a close-up, turn on ray tracing and see how it's taking shape. Okay, so I think I'm done looking into the 2 materials that I'd like to choose, but as you can see in here, and I'm gonna go ahead and use my pan to really zoom in and my dolly so you guys can see, I've used actually a graphic right here, and I added a small logo right here at the bottom. So how can you do that? You can essentially create your own logos, graphic designs, whatever you have on hand, and you can use the libraries right here to create a new group or a new folder where you can be placing and adding certain design logos. And I use the drag and drop option to position my my logos and my graphic designs. I'm going to go ahead and double click onto my graphic right here so you guys can see it. This is the centerpiece. This is what allows me to move it front and back. And then similar to other areas of Adobe Creative Cloud, you are able to make it bigger or smaller. Of course, hold the Shift button if you'd like it to scale up or down in proportion. Same thing with my logo down here. I use the drag and drop method to apply the logo in here, and as you can see, this is really cool about Stager is that it essentially moves and follows the object as you work with the design. So next we'll work on setting up the backdrop elements. In the scene panel right here, I'm going to find my handbag saddle, and out of the 3 options that are available right here, which is a collision, I already explained the collision. Don't disable it. It's always nice to have it enabled because it allows this particular 3D form to interact properly with other 3D forms. You can lock it, and then the last one is to essentially hide. I'm going to go ahead and hide them for a moment just so that I can set up the plane. The plane can be found right here in the basic shapes. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the plane. So right here in the object, I set up my width as 30, my length as 30, corner radius, I left it as 0, but you're welcome to change that. And then the corner sides is also 20. As far as the material, I like this asphalt track glossy material, but again, if you click right here in your starter assets, right here under your materials, you're welcome to change that. I'm gonna make sure this is selected just so you guys can see. You can change to a lot of different options. I really like this clean concrete. Now don't forget in the material section right here into the pattern, if your dimensions are too large, don't forget to either increase them or decrease them. Usually for me it requires a repeat that's bigger, so that way it essentially helps to hold up the scene. Now I like to work with my 1, 2, 3 or the orbit, the pan, and the dolly to essentially achieve a top view of my plane, so that way I can create these side walls. I will use the cube, so you could work with the dimensions like that. You can also work with the XY parameters. And then I'm going to go ahead and use the, I'm going to hold shift, so that way it only moves in one particular direction. And right here, change the depth to 1. I like to turn on bevel because walls are never really too straight. So right here on the sides, I'm going to go ahead and put it a 0.5 to just make the corners a little bit softer, looking something like that. So next thing, I'm gonna go ahead and Command D to duplicate this, and then I will use the arrow to move the plane, and then I will use the rotation to rotate it at a 90-degree angle. Gonna go ahead and place them next to each other. As you can see, Stager has a snap option, which is really helpful because what it does is it allows me to see when the two walls or the two objects have been positioned properly. Okay, so now that's coming along pretty nicely. Stage right here. Next thing what I'll do is, instead of using the cube and creating my own shelving unit in here, which can be pretty straightforward and easy to do, scale it down just so you guys can see. You can create a custom shelving unit, but there's no need for that when we actually have one in the models right here. So I'm gonna select this. It's way too big, so I'm just gonna go ahead and scale it down a little bit, and then I will move it back into, you see, now that collision is turned on, you'll see that the shelf actually is trying to avoid the objects around it. To be very careful, it's very sensitive, so just take your time. All right, so that looks finished. I like to take a cleaner view from the top so I can make sure that it's all coming along nicely. Now the next thing, I think what my product right here needs is maybe like a pedestal, but not the already established pedestal. It's a little too overly designed for me. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna make my own pedestal, select my bags, and I'm gonna go ahead and hide them so that way I can create my pedestal. I'm gonna use the cube panel again, and what I'll do is I'm totally gonna eyeball this. I'm gonna hold shift and then make this into, I don't know, about that size. Of course, you can always go into your object and make sure that the width, the height, and the depth is within your measurements and whatever you were envisioning. And then what I'll do is you can do either Command C, Command V, or Command D to duplicate this particular object right here, and I'll just use the arrow up to bring it up, and I'm going to use the scale Y to scale it down a little bit. That's about the size that I need. And now that I have everything set up, I'm going to, again, I like to use my dolly and my orbit pan to make sure that it's all coming along as I had envisioned it. Okay, that looks good. Okay, so now we're ready for the material selection. Again, I'm going to use the materials that are available right here for me, but of course you can use the Adobe Substance starters stock to select different materials, download them, import them, as I've already shown you how to do. So for us right now, I'm gonna use my selection to select one item at a time, one cube at a time. I'm gonna try the clean concrete. I think I need to increase the repeat a little bit so that it gives me a more realistic view. I will do the same for the others. And that is what I've chosen so far. Let's go ahead and zoom in so we can see the details. And it might be helpful at this point to turn on ray tracing just so we can have an idea at what the materials are starting to look like. Gotta remember that when you turn on ray tracing, it gets a bit slower, but it really helps you picture the objects and what you've been working on so far. You can zoom in and out, rotate, orbit as you wish, but let it load so you can have a better idea. So you can disable the collision to essentially unlink these two objects. Like I showed you earlier, you can use the command to remove certain things. Let's say maybe this handle, I don't know if it's necessary, but I'll leave it for now to essentially create this, to create the visual that you were going for. So the last thing we're going to go over, or second to last, is going to be adding physical lights to the scene. Physical lights can be positioned directly onto the scene, giving you more control over each light with natural fall off over the distance. So a lot of those are going to be available in the environments section. So right here you can select lights and see what's already available. By selecting the plus button, you can add a light of your choosing. I usually turn down the intensity. It's maybe just a little too bright for me because the concrete I chose or the material I chose is already light in nature. So you can add as many lights as you'd like in here. But of course, I have to point out that a lot of the lights are also available as presets. Lots of different options. You can select some of them to see what it would look like. I do like this studio light, but let's go back to my viewport camera just so we can see where they would be positioned. If you don't like them, you can go back to the environment and delete or hide certain lights that you like. So now, last thing I wanted to show you is if you're not ready to render it yet, if you'd like to see, again, what it might look like, you can turn on ray tracing, wait until it loads. When it's loaded nicely, you can use the share button right here at the very top. Click on it, and then you can snapshot as a PNG, or you can also publish a 3D scene, which is really cool because you can essentially share the link with anyone, and they can, rotate at a 360 and have a 360 view of your model. So pretty neat. And last but not least is going to be our render section. Right here, it's really at your preference. I usually select PNG if it is a quick model that I was looking for. I don't always need to export a PSD with it. You can export the camera view that we saved earlier or the viewport camera that we left it at. Of course, the file name, you can always change that. Presets, medium, high. You can leave it as you'd wish, how many samples you'd like to have, resolution. I always leave my resolution as full, and then you can click as render. All right, and that's all we have for now. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you'd like me to focus on next.